Ethan wandered deeper into the heart of the forest, his boots crunching over brittle leaves, the sound oddly muted, as if the air itself absorbed any noise he made. The forest had grown unnaturally quiet, no birdsong, no rustle of wind through the branches, just an oppressive, unnatural stillness. As he pushed through the dense underbrush, a strange opening appeared ahead, bathed in an eerie, pale light. It was a clearing, perfectly circular, surrounded by towering trees whose gnarled branches clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers. The grass was unnaturally lush, almost glowing under the light of a sun that seemed dimmer than it had moments before. Ethan paused at the edge, feeling an inexplicable chill crawl down his spine. The air inside the clearing seemed heavier, pressing against his skin, yet utterly silent. He took a cautious step forward, and the sound of his footfall disappeared entirely. It wasn't muffled, it was gone, swallowed into an abyss of silence. A faint shiver of unease turned to full-blown dread as he tested it again. He stomped his foot, clapped his hands, even called out a tentative hello into the void. No echo, no response, not even the sound of his own breathing reached his ears. The silence pressed harder the farther he ventured in. His heartbeat felt like a drum inside his chest, loud enough to be deafening. He gripped his camera tightly, as if the familiar weight of it might anchor him to reality. Pulling it to his face, he snapped a photo of the clearing, hoping to capture its eerie stillness. When he glanced at the camera's display, he froze. The screen showed something that wasn't there, a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the clearing, its form barely visible among the trees. Whipping his head around, Ethan scanned the area. The figure was gone, or perhaps it had never been there at all. He tried another photo, and another, but each one showed the same thing, shadowy figures just on the edges of the frame, moving closer with every shot. He could almost feel them watching him now, though nothing appeared to his naked eye. The silence became suffocating, thick and cloying like a damp cloth pressed against his face. His pulse quickened as he realized he could no longer hear it. It was as if the clearing had stripped him of all sound, pulling him into a vacuum where nothing existed but his growing fear. He stumbled further into the clearing, drawn by a strange compulsion, as if the stillness were a living thing beckoning him closer. In the center, he noticed something bizarre, a circle of smooth, flat stones arranged with unnatural precision. Each one bore carvings of symbols he couldn't understand but somehow felt familiar, like fragments of a long-buried memory clawing their way to the surface. Kneeling to inspect one, he saw that the symbols seemed to shift subtly when he looked away, their edges bleeding into one another like ink in water. Suddenly, a faint vibration coursed through the ground beneath him. It wasn't a noise but a sensation, a low, humming tremor that seemed to emanate from the stones. The clearing felt alive now, pulsating with an energy he couldn't describe. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind as shadows began to stretch unnaturally across the ground, moving without a source of light. Ethan stumbled back, his legs heavy, as though the clearing itself was trying to root him in place. He looked up to see the trees leaning in, their branches no longer still but swaying, reaching, grasping. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a shape darting between the trees just beyond the clearing. It wasn't human. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs bending in unnatural angles as it moved soundlessly. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to obey. The silence grew heavier, oppressive, as though the clearing had decided he had trespassed too far. The figures in the photos flashed in his mind, closer and closer, and now they seemed to surround him. Every shadow became a threat, every movement a harbinger of something unspeakable. Ethan's breath hitched as he realized he could feel eyes on him, not just one pair, but dozens, maybe hundreds, all around. Something was watching, waiting, and whatever it was didn't want him to leave. As Ethan stood paralyzed in the oppressive silence of the clearing, his eyes fell on something half buried in the mossy ground near the circle of stones. It was a weathered, leather-bound book, its edges frayed and corners eaten away by time. The sight of it struck an odd chord within him, familiar, yet unplaceable, as if the object had been plucked directly from a forgotten dream. The symbols on its cracked cover mirrored those etched into the stones, twisting unnaturally as his gaze lingered. Against his better judgment, he reached down and picked it up, the leather cold and damp in his hands. The moment his fingers touched the book, a wave of nausea swept over him. His vision blurred, and he was overcome by an almost unbearable sense of déjà vu. He flipped open the book, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with handwriting that looked hurried, almost panicked. The ink seemed fresh, glistening as if it had been written moments before, yet the words were smeared, making them difficult to decipher. His stomach dropped as he read one of the fragmented sentences aloud, The silence takes everything, it leaves nothing but the shadow of who you were. A strange, rhythmic humming began to fill his head, not from the clearing, but from deep within his mind. The sensation was disorienting, like a memory trying to force its way to the surface. He flipped to another page and froze. There, drawn in meticulous detail, was a sigil, its lines intricate and interwoven. It triggered a sharp pang of recognition. Ethan had seen this before, on the back of an old photograph his grandmother kept hidden in a wooden box. A photograph of her, as a young woman, standing at the edge of a clearing remarkably similar to this one. The book suddenly felt unbearably heavy, as though it carried not just knowledge, but the weight of every soul that had ever been trapped here. Ethan remembered the warnings his grandmother used to whisper late at night, tales of places where the forest devoured sound and silence was a harbinger of death. She would sing a haunting lullaby, her voice trembling, as if the song itself was a ward against something unspeakable. Now, as he stood clutching the book, fragments of the melody began to echo in his mind, threading through the oppressive silence like a faint, haunting plea. A chill crept up his spine as he turned another page and found a passage that felt eerily personal. Beware the stones, they are not markers but locks. To disturb them is to invite the watcher. As he read, the shadows around the clearing seemed to grow darker, thicker, pulsing in sync with his quickening heartbeat. Ethan turned the book over in his hands, and something fell out, a folded piece of paper, brittle but intact. Carefully, he unfolded it and gasped. It was a sketch of a young boy standing at the edge of the same clearing, his features eerily similar to Ethan's own. Written below in shaky handwriting was a single name, Ethan. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Had his grandmother been here? Had she known about this place? And why was his name in the book? The more he thought about it, the more his memories felt fractured, incomplete. He remembered vague snippets, his grandmother's trembling hands, the way she'd avoid certain questions about her past, and the way she would stare out the window at dusk, humming that same mournful tune. It was as though she had always known this moment would come, that Ethan would one day find this place. Suddenly, the symbols on the stones began to glow faintly, pulsing in an otherworldly rhythm that matched the humming in his head. The silence seemed to tighten around him, growing heavier with each passing second. The shadows that danced along the edge of the clearing started to take shape. Indistinct figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, their presence both menacing and sorrowful. Ethan stumbled backward, clutching the book like a lifeline, his breath shallow as the figures stepped closer. They moved unnaturally, as if the silence itself animated them, and their hollow gazes felt like they were peering into his very soul. Then, the ground beneath him shifted. The mossy earth trembled as if the clearing was waking up, reacting to his presence. A sharp, searing pain shot through Ethan's left hand, and he dropped the book. Looking down, he saw a mark etched into his skin, the same sigil from the book now burned into his flesh. He tried to wipe it away, but it wouldn't budge, as if the clearing had branded him, claiming him as part of its grim legacy. Memories that weren't his own began to flood his mind. Images of people standing where he now stood, their faces twisted in terror as the shadows consumed them. Each one left behind something precious, a memory, a name, or even their sanity. The clearing wasn't just a trap, it was a devourer of identity, erasing those who entered it from the world and absorbing their essence into its endless silence. Ethan's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, clutching his head as the humming grew louder, more invasive. He could hear his grandmother's voice now, faint but urgent, as if calling to him from the depths of his mind. Run, Ethan. Don't let it take you. Remember who you are. But the words felt distant, like they were slipping away, swallowed by the same silence that now threatened to consume him whole. Ethan sat on the damp, mossy ground, clutching his throbbing hand where the sigil had burned itself into his flesh. The air around him felt heavier with every passing moment, the oppressive silence closing in like an invisible vice. He glanced at the book lying a few feet away, its pages fluttering despite the lack of wind, as if unseen hands were rifling through it. The sigil on his palm pulsed faintly, and with each pulse, the clearing seemed to shift. Trees leaned closer, shadows thickened, and the circle of stones at the center began to glow faintly with an ominous light. Suddenly, the humming in his head returned, but this time it carried a voice, a deep, guttural whisper that resonated inside his skull rather than his ears. "You do not belong here," it growled, each word dragging across his consciousness like nails on glass. Ethan staggered to his feet, his breath shallow and quick, and looked around wildly. The clearing had transformed. The stones were now surrounded by the shadowy figures he had glimpsed in his photos, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They stood motionless, waiting, as if expecting him to act. Then came the ultimatum. The voice returned, louder and more insistent, as if the clearing itself had decided to speak. "A price must be paid," it intoned. "You will leave nothing, or everything." Ethan's pulse raced as the weight of the words sank in. What did it mean by everything? He stumbled back a step, his foot catching on the edge of one of the glowing stones. In an instant, the air around him rippled, and the clearing seemed to pull him into itself. He was no longer standing in the forest, but in a void, endless blackness stretching in every direction, punctuated only by the faint, ghostly figures of the shadows. From the darkness, a shape emerged. It was massive and indistinct, its form shifting like smoke in water. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed faintly with an unsettling light, and its voice reverberated through the void, shaking Ethan to his core. "You have trespassed," it said, "and now you must choose. What will you leave behind?" The creature extended a shadowy limb, pointing to Ethan's chest, and a sharp, searing pain shot through him. Memories began to surface, his childhood, his grandmother's lullaby, the first camera he ever held, each one flashing before his eyes like fragments of a life that didn't feel entirely his anymore. The voice continued, cold and merciless. "Give me what is precious, your memories, your mind, or your voice. Choose or be consumed." Ethan's knees buckled as he processed the horrifying options. To lose his memories would mean forgetting everything that made him who he was, his family, his passions, his very identity. To lose his mind would leave him a hollow shell, wandering aimlessly, perhaps trapped forever in this cursed place. And to lose his voice, that thought alone filled him with dread. His voice was his lifeline, his ability to connect with the world, to express himself. The void shifted again, and Ethan found himself standing back in the clearing. The stones glowed brighter now, and the shadowy figures had drawn closer. They formed a circle around him, their hollow gazes boring into his soul. He could feel the weight of their despair, as if each one had made their own impossible choice and had been left broken by it. A sudden wave of clarity washed over him. The clearing wasn't just a trap, it was a predator, feeding on the essence of those it ensnared. Ethan clutched his head, the voice now a deafening roar inside his mind. "Choose," it bellowed, the ground beneath him trembling violently. Desperation clawed at his sanity as he considered his options. He thought of his grandmother's warnings, the photograph, and the lullaby. The clearing had taken something from her, too, he realized, something she had carried with her for the rest of her life. He glanced down at the book, lying open at his feet, and saw a new passage scrawled across the pages, as if written in real time. The clearing will always demand its due. There is no escape without sacrifice. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes as he made his choice. He reached for the book, his trembling fingers brushing against the pages. "Take my memories," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Take them and let me go." The moment the words left his lips, the sigil on his palm burned brighter, and the shadows surged forward. They swirled around him, their hollow faces inches from his own, and then plunged into his chest. Ethan screamed silently, his voice stripped away by the clearing's oppressive silence. His mind fractured as pieces of his identity were torn from him, leaving behind a hollow ache. When it was over, Ethan collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The clearing was quiet once more, the shadows gone, the stones dim. He looked down at the book in his hands, its pages now blank, and realized he couldn't remember why he had come to the forest, or even who he was. All that remained was an inexplicable sense of loss, a void where his memories had been. The clearing had let him go, but at what cost? As he stumbled out of the forest, the last fragments of his past slipping away, he felt the clearing watching him, waiting for its next victim. Ethan staggered deeper into the forest, his legs weak and his mind clouded, as if the clearing's oppressive silence had seeped into his very soul. His memories were fragmented, like shards of broken glass, sharp and disjointed. Every step felt heavier, and the air grew colder, biting at his skin. The world around him seemed to shift subtly, trees leaning unnaturally, their trunks contorting as if trying to twist out of his line of sight. Shadows danced along the edges of his vision, flickering just beyond clarity, their shapes too fluid and unnatural to be mere tricks of the light. The silence began to take on a new quality, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeply wrong. It felt alive, writhing and pulsing, as though the shadows themselves were drawing breath. Then, faintly, Ethan heard it, a whisper, so soft it was almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves carried on a non-existent wind. It didn't come from any one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding him, threading through the forest like an invisible net. The whisper wasn't a single voice but a chorus, layered and overlapping, their words indistinct and foreign. At first, Ethan thought it might be his imagination, the remnants of fear playing tricks on his fragile mind. But the whispers grew louder, each syllable carving into his psyche, and he realized they weren't random. They were calling his name. Ethan, the voices hissed, drawn out like a breath exhaled from the depths of the earth. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the forest seemed to absorb the light, leaving the shadows untouched. The voices grew more insistent, each syllable dripping with malice and familiarity, as though the forest itself knew him intimately, his fears, his regrets, his weaknesses. He clutched at his head, trying to drown them out, but the whispers only grew sharper, more focused. They spoke of things he didn't remember, but felt he should, memories that had been taken from him in the clearing. They described moments of his life he couldn't recall, people he might have loved, places he might have called home. "Do you remember, Ethan?" one voice asked, clear and venomous, echoing through the void. He didn't, and that was the most terrifying part. As he stumbled forward, the whispers began to manifest in the world around him. The shadows stretched and twisted, forming shapes that flickered like smoke caught in a sudden gust. They coalesced into vague human figures, their forms barely substantial, like reflections in a rippling pond. Their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, glowed faintly, pinpoints of pale, hungry light. Ethan froze as one of the figures stepped closer, its movements jerky and disjointed, like a marionette on tangled strings. It tilted its head, and though it had no mouth, he heard its voice clearly. "You cannot leave. You belong to us now." Ethan's breathing quickened, each shallow gasp loud in the deafening silence. He tried to run, but his legs felt like they were wading through water, the ground beneath him soft and resistant, as though the forest itself was trying to hold him in place. The shadows followed, their forms stretching unnaturally, limbs extending and curling around the trees like living tendrils. He could feel their intent, a cold, malevolent hunger that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. Suddenly, the forest shifted again. The ground beneath Ethan's feet gave way, and he stumbled into another clearing, smaller but somehow more suffocating than the last. The whispers intensified, the voices now a cacophony that filled the air, pressing against his eardrums and drowning out his own thoughts. In the center of this clearing was a single object, a mirror, tall and ornate, its surface cracked and weathered. The frame was carved with the same symbols he had seen on the stones, their jagged lines pulsing faintly with a sickly light. Ethan approached the mirror cautiously, compelled by a force he couldn't resist. As he drew closer, the whispers became words again, distinct and chilling. "Look. Remember." He didn't want to. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn away, to run, but his body moved on its own, drawn to the mirror like a moth to a flame. When he finally stood before it, the reflection that greeted him wasn't his own. The figure in the mirror was him, but not. Its eyes were hollow, its skin pale and lifeless, its mouth twisted into an expression of anguish. Ethan staggered back, but the reflection didn't move. Instead, it leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to reach through. Its voice echoed in his mind, overlapping with the chorus of whispers. "You gave them everything. Now there is nothing left." Panic surged through Ethan as the reflection began to change, its features twisting into a grotesque parody of his own. The shadows behind it moved, clawing at its body, consuming it piece by piece until it dissolved into the void. The mirror cracked, splintering outward, and with each crack, the whispers grew louder, more aggressive. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices screamed in unison. "You are ours." The shadows surged forward, engulfing him, and for a brief moment, Ethan felt himself falling into an abyss of silence. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the forest, the mirror and clearing gone as if they had never existed. But the whispers remained, faint and persistent, threading through the silence like a dark promise. Ethan realized with chilling certainty that they would never leave him, that the forest had marked him, and the shadows would always be watching, waiting for the moment he returned to claim what was left of him. Ethan stumbled through the dense forest, the whispers clawing at the edges of his mind like invisible talons. Each step felt like dragging himself through quicksand, the ground beneath him growing softer, more unstable, as if the forest itself sought to consume him. The silence was no longer merely oppressive. It was alive, seeping into his thoughts and twisting them into dark, unrelenting paranoia. Every flicker of shadow, every barely perceptible movement in the corner of his vision, felt like a harbinger of something unspeakable waiting to pounce. His flashlight flickered weakly, its beam swallowed by the forest's unnatural gloom. He clung to it like a lifeline, the only shred of reality anchoring him against the creeping madness. But even the light couldn't protect him from what came next. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness. Not solid figures, but fragments of moments, memories he couldn't quite place. A child's laughter, faint and distant, echoed through the void, sending a chill down his spine. It wasn't just any laughter. It was familiar. His sister's laugh, one he hadn't heard in years, now distorted and wrong, like an old recording played backward. He froze as the laughter grew louder, morphing into sobs. The sound was close now, unbearably intimate, as if it were coming from just behind him. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing there. Only the dense wall of trees, their branches writhing like skeletal hands reaching for him. The sobs stopped abruptly, replaced by a voice that made his blood run cold. "Why did you let me go, Ethan?" It was her voice, clear and accusatory, filled with pain and betrayal. Ethan shook his head violently, gripping his temples as if trying to force the voice out. "You're not real," he muttered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real." But the voice persisted, more insistent now. "You left me," it accused. "You forgot me." He fell to his knees, his body racked with a cold sweat. The memories came flooding back unbidden. A day by the river, a sudden accident, and the suffocating guilt that had haunted him ever since. He hadn't forgotten. He had buried it, hidden it deep within himself, but the forest was unearthing everything. The shadows around him began to shift, taking on new forms. They weren't faceless anymore. They had features now, half-formed, indistinct faces that seemed to flicker between the living and the dead. One of them stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It looked like his sister, but its eyes were wrong, black voids that sucked in what little light remained. "Do you remember now?" it whispered, its voice layered with echoes, each one more chilling than the last. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing, but the figure followed, its steps soundless, its presence suffocating. The forest itself seemed to conspire against him. The trees swayed unnaturally, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes that reached for him like grasping hands. The ground beneath his feet pulsed with a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat, as if the earth itself were alive, feeding off his fear. He tried to run, but his legs felt heavy, his movements sluggish, as if the air around him had thickened into molasses. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices merging into a cacophony that echoed inside his skull. They spoke of his deepest fears, his failures, and the things he had tried to forget. "You are weak," they hissed. "You cannot save anyone. Not her, not yourself." The words cut deep, each one like a dagger twisting in his chest. Ethan clenched his fists, his breathing ragged, as he fought to drown out the voices. But the more he resisted, the louder they grew, feeding on his desperation. The forest began to distort further, the trees bending at impossible angles, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The ground beneath him shifted, revealing a pit that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void. At its edge stood the shadowy figure of his sister, her form flickering like a dying flame. "Come with me, Ethan," she said, her voice soft and mournful. "You don't have to fight anymore." Tears streamed down his face as he reached for her, the pull of her voice overwhelming. But just as his fingers brushed against hers, the illusion shattered. Her face twisted into something monstrous, her mouth stretching into an inhuman grin filled with jagged, needle-like teeth. The void beneath her erupted with a deafening roar, and tendrils of darkness shot out, wrapping around Ethan's limbs and dragging him toward the abyss. He screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony of whispers and laughter. The tendrils tightened, pulling him closer to the edge. He thrashed wildly, his flashlight clattering to the ground and extinguishing, leaving him in utter darkness. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices blending into an incomprehensible roar that threatened to consume his mind entirely. But amidst the chaos, one thought pierced through the noise. This isn't real. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan forced himself to focus. He closed his eyes, shutting out the shadows and the whispers, and concentrated on the one thing he could still control, his breath. Slowly, deliberately, he inhaled and exhaled, grounding himself in the rhythm. The tendrils loosened, the whispers faltered, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. When he opened his eyes, the shadows had receded, and the abyss was gone. But the forest was not finished with him. As he stumbled forward, exhausted and broken, he realized the temptation had only just begun. The shadows still watched, their presence lingering at the edge of his vision, waiting for the next crack in his resolve. The forest didn't need to kill him. It only needed to make him afraid enough to destroy himself. Ethan pressed forward, each step heavier than the last, the forest closing in around him like the jaws of a massive beast. The silence had transformed into a malevolent presence, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Every breath felt like it echoed in a vast, empty cavern, though no sound actually escaped his lips. The weight of the whispers lingered in his mind, fragments of words crawling through his thoughts like spiders weaving a web of doubt and despair. He didn't know how much longer he could endure it, until he saw the clearing again. The same circle of stones stood before him, but this time, the clearing had changed. The grass was gone, replaced by a dark, pulsing substance that looked like liquid shadow. The air shimmered with an oppressive energy, and the stones radiated an otherworldly light, their carved symbols glowing brighter with each pulse. In the center of the clearing stood a figure, a humanoid silhouette, tall and imposing, but its edges blurred and shifted like smoke trapped in a storm. Its eyes were two burning orbs of pale, sickly light, and its very presence seemed to distort reality around it. Ethan froze as the figure turned toward him, its gaze piercing straight into his soul. His body felt rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at him to run, yet he couldn't move. The entity raised a hand, if it could even be called that, and gestured for him to enter the clearing. As if compelled by an unseen force, Ethan stepped forward, his movements mechanical and unwilling. The liquid shadow rippled beneath his boots, cold and viscous, as if the ground itself were alive. "You have returned," the entity said, its voice a deep, resonant vibration that filled the air without sound. "You carry the mark. You belong to this place now." Ethan glanced down at his hand, where the sigil burned faintly, pulsing in time with the light of the stones. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't here by accident. The forest had called him, drawn him back to this cursed place, and now it demanded something more. "What do you want from me?" Ethan managed to choke out, his voice trembling. The entity tilted its head, as if amused by the question. "You know the answer," it said. "The clearing has taken your memories, but your soul remains whole. That is what I require. Your essence, your very being, to join the countless others who came before you." The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, revealing the faint, ghostly figures of those who had been consumed. Their faces were hollow and expressionless, their forms fractured and incomplete, as if they had been shattered and poorly reconstructed. Ethan recognized some of them, faces from the photographs he'd seen in the old book, and even faint echoes of his own family. His breath hitched as he spotted a younger version of his grandmother among them, her eyes vacant and filled with silent sorrow. The entity's voice grew sharper, more insistent. "You have a choice," it said, stretching a long, claw-like finger toward him. "Surrender willingly, and the pain will be fleeting. Resist, and the clearing will take what it wants piece by piece. Either way, your fate is sealed." Ethan's mind raced, desperation clawing at his thoughts. He felt the weight of the clearing's power pressing down on him, its presence seeping into every corner of his being. He couldn't fight it, not alone. Yet deep within the fragments of his broken memory, something stirred. A melody, soft and haunting, drifted into his consciousness. The lullaby his grandmother used to sing. Its tune was incomplete, but it carried a warmth that pushed back against the clearing's oppressive cold. Desperately, Ethan began to hum the melody, his voice cracking as he struggled to remember the notes. The entity recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a disrupted signal. The shadows writhed violently, their movements erratic and panicked. The melody wasn't just a song, it was a ward, a shield against the clearing's power, passed down through generations. His grandmother had known the forest's secret, and had armed him with a weapon he hadn't realized he possessed. The entity's eyes flared with rage, and it lunged toward him, its form stretching unnaturally as it reached out to claim him. Ethan's voice grew louder, stronger, as he sang the lullaby with everything he had. The sigil on his hand burned brighter, but this time it didn't hurt. Instead, it pulsed with a light that matched the melody, pushing back the darkness. The stones around the clearing cracked and splintered, their glow faltering as the symbols carved into them began to unravel. The entity howled, its voice a mix of rage and pain that reverberated through the air like a physical force. "You cannot escape," it bellowed, its form dissolving into a tempest of shadows. The ghostly figures around the clearing began to fade as well, their fractured forms unraveling into the wind. Ethan felt the ground beneath him tremble as the clearing itself began to collapse, the liquid shadow draining away into the earth. With one final, desperate cry, the entity surged toward him, but it was too late. The melody reached its crescendo, and the sigil on Ethan's hand erupted in a blinding light, consuming everything around him. The clearing, the entity, the shadows, all of it vanished, leaving him standing alone in the silent forest. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The sigil on his hand was gone, leaving only a faint scar as a reminder of what he had faced. The forest around him was still, but it no longer felt alive with malice. The clearing was gone, its power broken, but the memory of its horrors would haunt him forever. As he staggered to his feet and made his way back through the trees, a single thought echoed in his mind. The forest might let him go, but it would never truly release him. Ethan stumbled out of the darkness, his body weak and his breath ragged. The clearing was gone, or so he thought. As he moved through the forest, the oppressive silence followed him, clinging to the air like a predator stalking its prey. He could feel it. The clearing wasn't done with him. The sigil on his hand, though dimmed, pulsed faintly, a constant reminder that the entity's grasp on him hadn't entirely loosened. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. They spoke in fragmented sentences, their voices a chaotic blend of rage and pleading. "You think you've won, Ethan?" One voice hissed, sharp and venomous. "You are still ours," another growled colder, more patient. He clutched his hand, the faint burn of the sigil growing stronger, and looked around the forest. The trees seemed to shift, bending toward him as though drawn by some unseen force. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, their movements purposeful and deliberate, circling him like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Ahead, a faint glow pierced the gloom, a soft, pale light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Ethan's stomach churned. He didn't want to approach it, but the forest left him no choice. The path ahead bent unnaturally toward the light, and every attempt to move in another direction left him facing the same destination. Reluctantly, he stepped closer, each footfall sinking slightly into the ground as if the forest itself was trying to pull him under. When he reached the source of the light, his blood ran cold. The clearing was back. It wasn't the same as before, it was darker now, more distorted. The stones were cracked and jagged, their once glowing symbols now bleeding shadow. At the center stood the entity, fully formed this time, its towering figure exuding a palpable aura of dread. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling void, its edges flickering like dying embers. Two faintly glowing eyes stared directly at him, unblinking and filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. "You cannot leave," the entity said, its voice like a deep rumble of thunder rolling through the ground. "You carry the mark. You belong to the silence." It stretched an impossibly long arm toward him, its clawed fingers curling as though preparing to snatch his very soul. Ethan staggered back, his mind racing. The lullaby had driven it back before, but the melody felt incomplete, as if something vital was missing. He needed more than a song to defeat it this time. "Why me?" Ethan demanded, his voice trembling but defiant. "What do you want from me?" The entity paused, its massive form shifting slightly, as though amused by his question. "You are not the first," it said. "You will not be the last. The clearing takes what it is owed: memories, voices, lives. You escaped once, but no one leaves forever." The ground beneath Ethan's feet trembled, cracks spidering outward from where he stood, revealing a churning darkness below. It wasn't just the clearing that was alive, it was the very fabric of the forest, an ancient and insatiable hunger that demanded a final offering. Ethan realized then that this was the endgame. He couldn't run, and he couldn't fight, not in any conventional way. If he was going to survive, he had to outthink it. The sigil on his hand flared again, and with it, a flood of memories returned. Fragments of the lullaby, the symbols on the stones, and the words in the book he had found. The clearing didn't just take. It was a prison, a trap designed to hold something even older and more dangerous than itself. The stones weren't just markers, they were locks, sealing away the entity's true form. Ethan understood now. The clearing's power came from those it consumed, and the only way to weaken it was to sever that connection. Gritting his teeth, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out the small camera he had carried since the start of his journey. The entity's gaze snapped to it, and for the first time, it recoiled slightly. The camera had captured the shadows, fragments of its essence, and now it could be used against it. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan turned the lens on the entity and began snapping photos. Each flash of light tore through the darkness, illuminating the clearing and causing the shadows to writhe and scream. The entity howled, its voice a deafening roar that shook the forest to its core. The sigil on Ethan's hand burned brighter, and the stones around the clearing began to glow once more, their fractured surfaces mending as the symbols re-etched themselves into the stone. The ground trembled violently, and the air was filled with a deafening cacophony of whispers and screams. The entity lunged at Ethan, its form unraveling as it reached for him. But he stood his ground, his finger pressing the shutter again and again. With one final, blinding flash, the entity exploded into a torrent of shadows, its form scattering like ashes in the wind. The clearing shuddered, its oppressive silence lifting for the first time. The stones glowed brightly, their light sealing the cracks in the ground, and the pulsing darkness vanished, leaving behind only the faint hum of the forest. Ethan dropped to his knees, his body trembling as exhaustion overtook him. The sigil on his hand faded into nothingness, leaving behind only a faint scar. He looked around, expecting the shadows to return, but the forest was quiet, peaceful almost. The clearing was gone, replaced by an empty patch of earth that felt strangely serene. Ethan knew the forest had released him, but he also knew the cost. The memories he had lost were gone forever, and the faint whispers that lingered in the back of his mind were a reminder that the clearing's hunger would never truly be satisfied. As he made his way back through the forest, the weight of what he had endured pressed heavily on him. He had survived, but the scars, both physical and mental, would remain. The clearing had been defeated, for now, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it found its next victim. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the forest, the silence waited. Ethan emerged from the forest, the early dawn casting pale light over the treetops, but the air around him still felt wrong. Too quiet, too heavy. His legs wobbled with exhaustion, his mind clouded with fragments of what had just happened. He had escaped the clearing, faced the entity, and somehow survived, but something lingered. The sigil on his palm was gone, but a faint sensation remained, as if it had left behind an invisible mark that bound him to the forest's dark heart. The whispers had stopped, but the silence wasn't natural. It felt deliberate, calculated, like a predator lying in wait. As he stumbled onto the road that marked the forest's edge, he glanced back. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, yet the clearing was nowhere in sight. It had vanished, as if the forest had swallowed it whole. A wave of unease rippled through him. He had seen it collapse, the stones mended, the entity scattered, but he knew deep down it wasn't truly over. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to move on, returning to the mundane rhythms of his life. But things were different. He'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows that flickered too quickly to belong to anything real. At night, the silence in his apartment became unbearable, pressing against his ears until he could hear his own heartbeat pounding like a drum. And then there were the dreams. Each night, Ethan found himself back in the forest, walking toward the clearing. The trees were denser, their trunks bending inward, creating a tunnel that funneled him to the same place no matter how hard he tried to turn away. The clearing was always waiting, its stones cracked and glowing faintly, the sigils etched into them pulsating with malevolence. And in the center, the entity stood, watching, waiting, whole again. In one particularly vivid dream, the entity spoke. Its voice wasn't the thunderous, booming presence it had been before. This time, it was quiet, intimate, seeping directly into his thoughts. "You didn't defeat me," it said, its hollow eyes burning brighter with each word. "You only delayed the inevitable." Ethan woke drenched in sweat, the echoes of the entity's voice reverberating in his head. His hand throbbed where the sigil had once been, and when he turned on the light, he thought he saw faint lines on his palm, too faint to be real, but there nonetheless. Desperate for answers, Ethan returned to the book he had found in the clearing. He'd taken it with him when he fled, its pages blank at the time, as though it had been stripped of meaning. But now, words had begun to reappear, scrawled in the same frantic, trembling hand as before. Each time he opened it, new fragments were written, warnings, cryptic messages, and questions that seemed directed at him. The clearing never lets go. It doesn't need you to stay, it only needs you to carry it forward. Another chilling line followed. The silence spreads. "You are the vessel now." Ethan slammed the book shut, his pulse racing. What did it mean? Was the clearing still inside him, using him as a conduit to reach the world beyond the forest? The thought filled him with dread. He hadn't escaped at all. He had been chosen for something far worse. The final piece of the mystery came in the form of a photograph. Ethan retrieved his camera, still covered in scratches and dirt from his time in the forest. He hesitated before turning it on, afraid of what he might see. When the screen flickered to life, his worst fears were confirmed. The photos he had taken in the clearing were still there, but they weren't the same. The images shifted as he stared at them, the shadows within moving unnaturally, as though alive. In one frame, the entity's burning eyes stared directly at the lens, its outstretched hand pointing at him. But the last photo was the most disturbing. It showed Ethan himself, standing in the clearing, his face pale and lifeless, his eyes hollow voids of darkness. Behind him, the stones glowed fiercely, the sigils radiating with an intensity that made his stomach churn. He dropped the camera, the screen shattering on impact, but the image was burned into his mind. In the days that followed, strange things began happening in the town. People reported unnatural silences, parks where birds stopped singing, streets where footsteps made no sound. A few claimed to see fleeting figures in the shadows, their eyes faintly glowing. Ethan's own reflection began to trouble him. In mirrors and windows, he sometimes saw the hollow-eyed version of himself, staring back with a malevolent grin that didn't match the expression on his face. The truth became impossible to ignore. The clearing wasn't just a place, it was a presence, a force that could not be contained. By leaving the forest, Ethan had brought it with him, a seed of its darkness planted in the world beyond. And now it was growing. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, threading through the silence of his home. They spoke only one word, over and over, with a quiet, dreadful finality: soon. Ethan realized he hadn't escaped. The clearing had simply changed its game. It was no longer confined to the forest. It was everywhere now, spreading through him, through the photos, through the silence that crept into the lives of those around him. The clearing didn't need to trap its victims anymore. It had found a way to come to them. And as Ethan sat alone in his darkened apartment, the weight of the silence pressing down on him once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that the clearing wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Waiting for the next moment of weakness, the next slip into fear, the next soul to claim. Because the mystery of the clearing wasn't just that it existed, it was that it would never stop.